Jungle.
Hello, you are listening to Trump Republic Radio. It is October 20th, 2017. I'm your host, Enzo Quesada, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Bobby Hester.
Hello, everyone.
So this week, we're getting out the midweek mini podcast a bit late. We had to switch up the topics. We were going to originally do an update on the primaries and midterms. We worked on the database extensively this week. We updated the Senate stuff, but we're going to hold that off for a bit because we want to get the governor database kind of more updated than where it is. So we decided to go over something that I've wanted to talk about for a while. I wanted to get more into right-wing political ideology and kind of the backgrounds that influences our beliefs, especially mine. Especially to me, paleoconservatism is probably the closest thing to my beliefs. And it also impacts things in the modern day. Donald Trump could be considered a paleoconservative. That's the base roots of his platform. People don't realize that, they always say Donald Trump had no ideas, but he did. His platform is very solid. We knew these policies throughout the campaign. We're also going to get into right-wing populism, a big thing that's happening across the world right now, something that gives us an opportunity to see our platform implemented and just pitch some ideas and a platform for right-wing populism that could win us back our country. So with that said, I'm going to mainly go through paleoconservatism. I wrote the outline on this. Bobby, just interject on things wherever you want.
Absolutely.
So what is paleoconservatism? Paleoconservatism, sometimes shortened to Paleocon, is a conservative political philosophy stressing tradition, limited government, and civil society, along with religious, regional, national, and Western identity. The international relations scholar Michael Fawley describes paleoconservatism as the following. Paleoconservatives press for restrictions on immigration, a rollback of multicultural programs, the decentralization of the federal policy, a restoration of controls upon free trade, a greater emphasis on economic nationalism and non-interventionism in the conduct of American foreign policy, and a generally revanche outlook on a social order in need of recovering old lines of distinction, and particularly the assignment of roles in accordance with traditional categories of gender, ethnicity, and race. So, paleoconservatism, it gets its paleo prefix from the Greek root for the word ancient or old, which is kind of a funny thing to say for paleoconservatism because it is a political philosophy that came out of the 1980s, but it believes that it is the authentic conservative tradition as opposed to neoconservatism, but because it calls back to a more original conception of American conservatism. So it has its roots in the old American right as opposed to what we have in the new American right or neoconservatism or the varying different philosophies that we have on the right right now. Libertarianism, you could also say, is a modern right-wing, or, there's also left-wing libertarianism, but right-wing libertarianism only really came out since the 1960s or 70s. So let's just go through the various different stances on paleoconservatism, give our thoughts on them. So the first thing I mentioned was restrictions on immigration, which is something that both me and Bobby are very hardcore on, something that we don't, back off on at all. We talk about on the Sunday show every single week about immigration. We have our, segment. We go very in depth because it's one of the most important things as far as the country's sovereignty is concerned.
We do at least 30 to 45 minutes.
Sometimes we talk about it for an hour.
Yeah, when you have a lot of stories there.
So I wanted to go into various justifications for why we have, very hardcore restrictionist ideas on immigration, both illegal and legal immigration. One of the best places for studies on immigration and why we need to have what I call patriotic immigration reform is the Center for Immigration Studies. So I just wanted to go through a bunch of different studies that kind of justifies our positions. So in regards to illegal immigration, people, during the Donald Trump campaign always said, oh, it would cost way too much to deport all the illegal aliens in the country. Did you get that a lot, Bobby?
Oh, every single time I tried to talk about immigration, if you took a hardline stance on it, someone eventually would bring up the cost of deportation. And so it costs so much money, it's like $55,000 to deport these people or something like that.
Yeah. Which is not actually the case. But, even people on the right I was meeting, were against mass deportations because of the price. But the Center for Immigration Studies actually breaks this down in one of their studies. And this study comes out of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So, what do you think the average cost for fiscal year 2016 it costs for ICE to deport someone?
Well, I'm just going to go with that number that they were using, about $50,000.
On average, it costs about $10,854.
Well, that's way cheaper than what most people were telling me.
Significantly lower than what people perceive. Now, what do you think is the cost yearly for illegal immigrants?
I would say about, you're saying like per immigrant?
Yes.
I would say upwards $100,000.
So the average estimate for illegal immigrants' fiscal drain is around, or this is for lifetime, not yearly.
Okay, for lifetime, all right.
It's still important, but the average fiscal drain, excluding their children, is $65,292. So when they always come at you with these arguments like, oh, we can't afford deportation, we can't afford to keep these people.
No, definitely not.
So based on the estimates, there's a total lifetime fiscal drain of around, assuming that we have 11.43 million illegal immigrants, which is a low estimate in our book.
It's likely around 20 to 30, maybe even 40, depending on real estimates.
The total lifetime fiscal drain of all the illegal aliens in this country is $746.3 billion.
Jesus.
Compared to the cost for deporting all of them, which would be $124.1 billion. So it is expensive to deport them all, but it is nothing compared to what we would pay to keep them all here.
It's essentially a seventh of the cost.
Yeah.
And even, you go back to what you were saying. $10,000 to deport, $65,000 per year on average. Again, that's about a sixth or a seventh of the cost.
Yes. So, it's no argument. These people on the right that don't want to do this, they call themselves conservatives, but you're not fiscally conservative if you think it's okay to keep them all here. Let alone the other argument that we always have against amnesty and also legal immigration, to where, foreign nationals, especially Hispanics, we have Pew Research polling on this. 8-2, they favor big government. And, they always say in the Republican Party, like, oh, we just need to appeal to Hispanics. They're natural conservatives. Even 3 generations down the line, they support big government 7-3. They're one of the most ardent supporters of big government. And it makes sense. You just look at Mexico. 2 of the 3 biggest political parties are socialist parties. This is how things run south of the border generally. So, amnesty and illegal immigration, is very detrimental to us. And, even the children of illegal aliens still have those polling voting for big government. So it's something that is an existential crisis for us. We can't risk these things. So I want to also get into some welfare usage for, immigrants compared to native households. The average household by an immigrant costs the taxpayers around $6,234 in federal welfare benefits yearly, which is 41% higher than the average native household, which receives $4,431. The average immigrant household consumes 33% more welfare cash, 57% more food assistance, and 44% more Medicaid dollars than the average native household. Housing costs about the same for both groups. And, this is higher for Hispanics. Households headed by immigrants from Central America and Mexico have the highest welfare cost, which is around $8,251 a year, which is 86% higher than the cost of native households. And we're talking legal immigrants, which is why we are highly against a lot of legal immigration, too. You look at the history of immigration in this country. After, the great wave of immigrants we got from Europe that they always cite is, we're so good for our country, we cut it off for generation.
Yeah.
Like a whole generation so they could assimilate. You look at where we are currently ever since the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which changed immigration dramatically and opened our doors to the third world. We have even more immigrants comparatively than then. But no one's even talking about shutting it down for a bit so these people can assimilate. Now they're saying assimilation is racist, which is crazy that this is an argument that we have to fend with. But even, comparing illegal immigrants, they cost more than the average native household. Illegal immigrant households cost an average of $5,692, driven largely by the presence of U.S.-born children. So usually when, illegal alien households come to the United States and they have their children here, they get their welfare through their children.
Right.
And their parents are the ones that fill out these applications, which, is not actually like a legal practice, but it happens anyways because most of the people in these welfare departments are sympathetic, and they're not going to call people out on welfare fraud because, we're supposed to be sympathetic. But in general, why do we want to be taking in any immigrants that are a fiscal drain on us? Why do we want to import people that are, burdens upon the taxpayers?
If anything, we should be, if you're going to take in any immigrants at all, they should be, net contributors to the economy. Net contributors as taxpayers. That's what they should be.
Which, is why we advocate for the RAISE Act on the show, moving over to a point-based system like they have in Canada or Australia, which no one calls them on being racist for having their programs. It's much harder to immigrate to Canada than it is the United States. All the liberals saying, if Donald Trump's going to be elected president, I'm moving to Canada. You probably can't qualify to move to Canada. But no one calls them out on these things. Mm-mm. But I guess we can go into a couple more areas on immigration and why it matters, and then we can move on to some other things. So as far as immigration and crime goes, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that immigrants, legal and illegal, comprise 20% of inmates in prisons and jails. The foreign-born are 15.4% of the nation's adult population. So they're overrepresented in jails, which, you always hear the argument, they commit less crime than the native-born citizens. Why are they in jails higher to the proportion then? Something is out of whack. But, in general, every single crime committed by an illegal alien or a legal alien is a crime that didn't need to happen. When legal alien or immigrants commit crimes, it's almost even worse because we let them come in.
Yeah, I hate when people try to use the excuse that, especially if you look up, let's say a certain type of crime. They say, Americans do that, natural-born Americans do that. And I say, that is our problem to deal with. You are importing more crime that doesn't need to happen. The other crime is going to happen regardless, and that's a problem for us to figure out. So why should we be making it even worse by taking in people that are prone to do that when you look at the statistics?
Yeah. And looking at some of the counties that in this country are worse affected by incarceration rates of illegal aliens, Maricopa County in Arizona, 22% of their felons are illegal aliens. Lake County, Illinois, 19% of jail inmates are illegal aliens. Collier County in Florida, 20 to 22% of jail inmates and arrestees are illegal aliens. Weld County, Colorado, 12.8 to 15.2% of those jailed are illegal aliens. So this is not just a problem for us in border states like us living in Texas. This is something that affects, states that are far away from the border, because it's so spread out with illegal aliens and how they migrate once they get into our country. Are there any other things that I want to get into as far as immigration? Let me see. One study that they have is very interesting, is we could raise for our federal government more than $250 billion in tax revenue by ending tax subsidies for unauthorized employment of illegal aliens. Because, different corporations can get deductions on wages, and they can get refundable tax credits. If we were to get rid of all of the stuff, $250 billion. Okay, our federal deficit, we're going to get into this on Sunday. They just passed that budget in the Senate. We have a deficit about, $680 billion?
No, today they said that the U.S. deficit was 666.
666.
For fiscal year 2017. The numbers came out this morning.
We could take $250 billion out of that if we just stopped subsidizing our own displacement by illegal aliens in the employment industry, which, they're not supposed to work whatsoever. It's crazy. Also, just as far as displacement of workers are concerned, I wanted to get into some numbers on that. Among natives with a high school degree, the fraction who were neither working nor looking for work rose from 26% in 1994 to 35% in 2015. Over the same period, the fraction of those immigrant counterparts who were out of the labor force actually declined from 12% to 8%. Turning to hours spent working, native-born high school dropouts worked an average of 1,391 hours per year between 2003 and 2015, while immigrant dropouts worked 1,955 hours per year. Native dropouts were seeing their working time declined from 41 equivalent full-time weeks in 2003 to 2005 period to 32 weeks from the 2012 to 2015 equivalent period, while immigrant dropouts declined only from 52 weeks to 50 weeks. While natives fell from 56% of the nation's high school dropouts to 52%, or from 56% to 52%, their share of labor performance by all dropouts declined much faster, from 50% in 2003 to 2005 to 40% from 2012 to 2015. Among men with more than a high school degree, there was no significant difference in work time between immigrants and natives. So, immigration, both legal and illegal, hurt our, poorest in the country. People never talk about this, The Democrats, they always say, we want to help minorities. We want to help the black community. The black community, on average, has less education credentials than whites. So that's, just a fact. Mm-hmm. Their unemployment rate amongst black youth is something like 1 in 4. So why are we taking out the entry-level jobs that they could actually work so they can actually have some social mobility in life and letting illegal or legal aliens working these jobs? That makes no sense to me. So, I think we hit immigration pretty hard. It's obviously a very, very important issue to talk about. And also, one of the most important things that they get into with paleoconservatism. VDare.com is one of the best places for paleoconservative thought, and they go very hard on immigration. It's a very good site to read. Let's go into some other aspects of paleoconservatism. So they call for a rollback of multicultural programs. It's a part of, freedom of association. I feel like freedom of association rights in this country are highly under attack.
They are.
especially what Obama was doing, which we just got rid of with the Department of Health and Human Services under Ben Carson. They would have a policy where, for minorities, they would look at any community that's majority white in the country, and they would pay minorities to move into these communities.
Yeah, they'd subsidize it.
They would subsidize it. They had to pay something like 15% of their wages to the federal government. But in return, they would give them thousands a month to give them households they wouldn't afford otherwise. And this is at the expense of the taxpayer. You're taking money from people that probably live in these communities and making them pay for neighbors that shouldn't be there in the first place.
Right.
That's just unjust in general. But another issue that they really talk about and stress a lot is affirmative action, which, I've always been staunchly against affirmative action, even from a very young age. I read an entire book back in third grade, I believe, on it, to build my views on these different things. And, I just don't see the point in positive discrimination. You're not going to fix racial issues in this country by discriminating against people. Why are you disenfranchising future generations of whites in this country to somehow equalize it with other racial groups? Especially with how whites are going to be a minority very soon. Most estimates are 2040, 2045. Do you think when whites are minorities in this country, anyone's going to repeal that?
Of course not.
Of course not. So, we got to do what it takes right now to get rid of affirmative action. Otherwise, you're going to be disenfranchising white households in the future very unjustly. And it's something that needs to be talked about. But, Republicans don't talk about that at all.
Nope.
None of the college Republicans talk about these issues because they're kind of controversial.
And anyone who does say it's labeled racist immediately.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to get into, which is very drastically different than what the average, conservative or Republican stance is on trade. They want to have a restoration control on free trade. This is one of the biggest things that the Paleoconservatives also emphasized. They emphasize more economic nationalism, which is a term you've often heard recently with Steve Bannon, who advocates similar policies. So if you look at the history of trade in this country and how the trade deficit has gone, you look at the post-war period up to, we changed most of our free trade agreements in around the 70s or 80s. I'm trying to think back. But we used to have the Bretton Woods system, which kind of put controls on trade and tried to balance out our trade deficit. We actually had a trade surplus back when we were under the Bretton Woods system. Now, can you look up for me the trade deficit where it is now?
Yeah, of course, I'll look it up.
Right when we moved over to free trade in this country, that's where our entire trade deficit comes from. And when you run it, yeah.
Yeah, the trade deficit in 2016 was $502 billion.
$502 billion.
Now, that was just for goods and services. Now, if you take out, everything, it was actually 750.
750.
So, anywhere between 502 and 750, depending on how you calculate it.
So, what does the trade deficit mean? I'll go into it right now. So, the trade deficit is what we have that is kind of like a deficit, what we're paying in various different ways, either through debt or selling off assets, or we also recoup it through what we export. But it is imports versus exports. We import in this country way more than we export. Our biggest trade deficit's with China. We also have a huge one with Mexico. When we enslave ourselves to a trade deficit, we're enslaving ourselves, because we're so decadent, to these foreign nations through our debt. It hurts the American dollar in the long run. We're also selling off assets that we have in the United States. It's a big problem in Vancouver, Canada. Something like half of Vancouver's real estate is owned by Chinese at the moment. So we're threatening our national sovereignty through selling our businesses in the United States to foreigners who don't have our interests, who could just sell these off and, liquidate it and move all that capital foreign. And, people don't realize that it's a very big economic threat to our country, our trade deficit. And you look at how this has affected our country in general. Our economy has been held back 16% in growth because of our trade deficit. Now, that is as of 2012. It's from a book that I read around a year ago, which is Free Trade Doesn't Work, which 16%, it doesn't sound a lot, but that difference is actually around the size of the entire economy of Canada. So it's a significant chunk of change, which could actually be a huge benefit to us in the United States. If we actually ran a positive, trade balance in this country, we'd be doing so good. And what this really hurts the most is manufacturing. We actually don't run they try to play it out like, oh, we can't compete in the global market in manufacturing. Our difference between us and most foreign countries is only something like 10%. A 10% tariff would make us way more productive in most manufacturing industries if we put this on foreign goods coming into the country. And that money could be spent on whatever, because it's a tax on foreign goods coming in. We could spend that. We could subsidize our own manufacturing base and make them more efficient. And, everyone complains like, oh, if you put tariffs, you're going to make prices go up. In the short term, that is correct. But, we have to think about what's actually happening. So one thing is, ever since we had NAFTA, we've lost over 1 million manufacturing jobs. How can even people buy these cheap goods if they don't have a job? That's one thing we need to worry about. Another thing is our capital, because of our trade deficit, is moving abroad. If we actually enforce a tariff and allow our manufacturing and production base to create these goods, and they'll have, a better advantage in our own home markets, that money's going to stay in the United States. So that's going to create jobs here. In the long run, we're actually going to get the prices of goods down in the country because our, own production industry will be better. The book that I talk about on free trade is, let me pull up my library on my Kindle so I can get you the author on that. Free Trade Doesn't Work by Ian Fletcher. An extremely good book. Some chapters are kind of hard to read, but overall, it's not too hard. So let's go into the next issue that paleoconservatives are really staunch on, and that is non-intervention in the conduct of American foreign policy. So this is another thing that I wanted to get to when we get into right-wing populism, but we can also get into it right now, really. Mm-hmm. So, in general, America is an empire, a massive empire. We have around over 700 bases across the globe. People don't even think about that. Why do we have so many bases abroad? America is an empire. And the paleoconservatives wanted to, eliminate our empire. We want to go back to actually being a country. We see the rise of China in the world, and, throughout the 20th century, we are the global hegemonic power. We are the world police. We saw what that did to us in Iraq. We've seen what has done to us in Afghanistan. We're still fighting these wars. We have kids that are now fighting in Afghanistan who are walking the same, patrol routes that their parents, patrolled at this point, or their older cousins or whatever. It's crazy. And, this is something Mattis was actually talking about that we're going to get into on Sunday. But actually, the number is about 800, and that's in over 70 countries. Why do we need this? This is a huge economic burden on us. We can't sustain this. We should be spending this on something else. It's insane. So, generally on the right, they see us more as the party of warmongering or foreign intervention. A lot of that is to blame on the neoconservatives. They have their plan for a new American century, which is one of the most harmful things that have ever happened in this country. We could do an entire episode on that. But in general, the paleoconservatives advocate for isolationism. We're not going to get involved in foreign wars. And also it comes with the idea that, hey, we can't expropriate our values on different societies. You know, we try to do nation building in Iraq. We fought to bring them democracy. They have studies on this. A democracy can't function in a country that has an IQ collectively of below 92 IQ points. Iraq is below that. Afghanistan is below that. Where we try to do this, it's just not going to work. I think we need to acknowledge that what works here in the United States can't work everywhere. And when we try to change this stuff, it makes the regions way worse. You look at what we did in Iraq. It's a failed state at this point. You look at what we did to Libya and Gaddafi. It was one of the most prosperous nations in Africa, and now it's a failed state. You know, and it's a waste of money. We spent, what, $3 trillion in Iraq or something?
Around that, yes.
That should have been spent here. We could have rebuilt our entire infrastructure. That could be spent on education. That could be spent on healthcare. It's insane. So, a couple more things that we can talk about on paleoconservatism before we move into some other things is they acknowledge that the United States is part of Western civilization, that the core of this country has been European Americans, and that has a distinctive identity to who we are, and we can't really get away from Western civilization. It built this country. It is one of the most successful civilizations in the world. But the left tries to, condemn Western civilization as the greatest evil of all time. But you look at what we have invented in Western civilization, the art, the inventions, the industry, how we've changed, travel. We got to the moon. I don't think that we should condemn the values that made us who we are and made this country great to begin with. And, it also plays into the immigration. One of the big things that they're worried about is a lot of people that aren't from Western nations, they have a hard time assimilating. Mm-hmm. And, you look at the history of immigration in this country, you look at the 1924 Immigration Act. We used to prioritize, immigrants from Europe because they're very similar to us and our values. It was easy to assimilate. Now, they talk about diversity. They want diversity. We have the lowest amount of diversity we've ever had in immigration. Something like a third of the immigrants in this country now come from Mexico.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this, a very similar thing on the show several weeks ago, I told a story about one of my professors in college that he told us, and I'll just go ahead and read it now because it's a perfect analogy for assimilation, to where he went to college in Iowa, and then he went to go get a job, so he had to go to Chicago. And he was a tennis player all throughout his college career. And he hardly did anything in business. He had a business minor. He wasn't even majoring in business. But he went to there was a company that was offering a job in Chicago. He went there, and they said, yeah, we'll hire you, but we're going to send you down to our Florida branch. So he went down to, I believe it was Tallahassee, if I remember the exact city correctly. So he went down there, and he got a job as a stock trader. He would just sit down there in front of a computer, and he would just trade stocks, call people, and do that all day long. Now, he never did anything like that in his college career. Now, the reason why they picked him, and this was a job that they had 3,000 applicants for, and it came down to 4 people that they hired. All 4 people were people who played sports in college. And the reason why is because people who play sports are used to losing. And when you're a stock trader, you got to be used to losing. Otherwise, you're going to go crazy and you're probably going to kill yourself. And I mean that, quite seriously in some regards, if you're doing negative returns. Now, the thing is, all 4 of those guys, they were very good at their job because it was a company culture. Then the next year, they decided to hire a few more people. Instead, they didn't hire sports people. Instead, the only people they decided to hire were people who went to Ivy League schools who were majored in that business, degrees. Within 6 months, that office was shut down because the people they hired did not fit into the pre-established company culture at all. Even though they were excellent at, you'd think they would be excellent at their jobs, and they're very good, but they did not fit into their company culture, and it disrupted it to the point where productivity dropped so low to where they had to shut down the branch, and he moved back to Iowa. Now, I didn't want to get too far off topic, but that's a perfect analogy for assimilation for immigrants into this country. You can be outstanding at what you're doing. You can be really, really smart. But if you're not going to assimilate, you're not going to fit in, and it's not going to end well.
Yeah. And, you look at immigration to this country and the restrictions we now put on Europe in prioritizing third world nations. We make it much, much harder for people from the United Kingdom to immigrate here than from Mexico or Central America. Our entire nation's lineage delineates from the United Kingdom. These are our cultural brothers. Why do we make it harder for them to come here than people from abroad or other nations in the third world? This is what the 1965 Hart-Celler Act did to the country. It's one of the most detrimental things we've ever done as far as immigration is concerned. But let's move on to some different things. The paleoconservatives kind of have some different beliefs as far as human nature, which is something that people don't really talk about as far as, conservatives or people in the GOP or Republicans. Paleoconservatives argue that since human nature is limited and finite, any attempt to create a man-made utopia is headed for disaster and potential carnage. Instead, they lead towards tradition, family, customs, religious institutions, and classical leanings to provide wisdom and guidance. So, it is an approach towards traditionalism. Most conservatives, they try to establish the status quo. The paleoconservatives want like a revolutionary reversionism back to traditionalism, which, people have such an aversion to the word traditionalism. But I've always viewed traditionalism as it's not a worship of the past. It is just maintaining the fire of your ancestors. I think it's a fallacy to believe that history moves in this linear sense where we only progressively get smarter. It's kind of a end of history Francis Fukuyama look on the world. That ever since we won the Cold War, things can only progressively get better. We can only do good. Whatever we do socially, and this is what progressives believe, whatever we do socially has no negative repercussions. But we've really destroyed in a lot of sense the family unit. And the family unit is, the biggest unit towards social prosperity in a nation. There are some other quotes I have here on the family. Paleocons often argue that modern managerial societies are a threat to stable families. Alan C. Carlson, the former president of the Rockford Institute, which is a paleoconservative institute, argues that the family is the natural and fundamental social unit, inscribed in our nature as human beings, rooted in marriage, rooted in the commitment to bring new life into the world, and rooted to a deep respect for both ancestors and posterity. So one of the big things that people, especially our age, forget about traditionalism is not only do you want to take the best of the wisdom of your ancestors, you also have a duty to the next generation, to give them a better life. It's our posterity. One of my favorite quotes in the Constitution, which I'm not a big Constitution guy, but it's secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. It's part of America First for me, and it's also traditionalism. We need to do what's best for ourselves and our future generations. We need to give them a better life than we experience. And I think people, especially of our age, forget that. They live in such a materialistic consumer society that's so atomized and nihilistic. They don't even think that it's good to have a family, that it's going to dampen their, the way they live their life now, watching TV shows and going and have mimosas and brunch. We've talked many times on the show. I did the show on cat lady policy. It goes very well into this I did with my girlfriend. They have studies. The equivalency of satisfaction you get from a marriage is mentally the same as getting $100,000 a year. So, committing yourself to a job as opposed to getting a marriage, unless you're making a lot of money, it's not going to be the same. And that's not even counting the satisfaction, dollars-wise, you have from being kids. And you go over decades, that 100,000 turns into millions of dollars. You're not going to get a satisfaction from being a single person is working like you ever will from having a family. It's something crazy that people forget. Just going a little bit more from Alan C. Carlson, he calls this a universal rule of human nature, true for Westerners and non-Westerners alike. He also argues that happiness comes through natural family bonds, and that the family of any nation shall be the way... the future of any nation shall be the way of the family. He defines the family as a man and a woman living in a social sanctioned bond called marriage, and for the purpose of propagating and rearing children, sharing intimacies and resources, and conserving lineage, property, and tradition. To be human is to be familial. Any significant departure from the family rooted in stable marriage and the welcoming of tradition and the respect for ancestors and posterity, any deviation from this social structure makes us in a way less human. That is, I think it is fair to say, the true message of modern science. And this is actually something that's heavily under threat right now. There's so many, especially communists, have always advocated for the destruction of the family unit, the nuclear unit. And also, it's not even an ardent communist. Hillary Clinton believes this as well. She has that book, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child. I just think there's something sick about that line of thinking. It's something that could not be as special as what you have with the mother and father. And, you have with the rise of feminism, people not even think that you need, say, a father to raise children. I've met a lot of people that grew up without fathers, and I can say for a certainty they miss out on something very strongly through missing that. And we also have, the different things with having an absence of a father. You are much likelier to go to jail, significantly more. Crime is a big problem. Living in poverty, significantly higher. Do you have any other thoughts on, the necessity of a family, Bobby?
No, I mean, I was just going to bring that up, but even though this is total just, what's the word I'm looking for? It's anecdotal. Yeah, I completely agree with you. From what I have seen in my personal life, every single person who I've known that's grown up in a single-parent household has not had the same, success rate that people who grow up with, both parents do. And I've seen that over and over and over again. They have, problems in school, problems with crime, problems with drugs. Now, that's not every single person, obviously, but as a rate of the people who I know, it's much, much higher.
Yeah. Are there any other things I want to get into paleoconservatives? One thing is they're anti-federalist. They want to have radical decentralization. They have a big emphasis on religion. They believe that religion and traditionalism can really guide us through life even more than what we believe to be reason. It gives us a grounding in something much bigger than ourselves. I think with that, I just want to say a couple people that are interesting that you should look up, listener, that can go further into paleoconservatism. I said before, Donald Trump is essentially a paleoconservative. Steve Bannon, who, fighting for us right now in the Make America Great Again movement, you could call him a paleoconservative. Pat Buchanan is the biggest advocate of paleoconservatism. One could say the father of, or not the father, but the torch bearer of paleoconservatism.
Maybe the father of modern paleoconservatism.
Yeah. He was the White House communications director from 1985 to 1987. He was the speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He was a 1992 and 1996 Republican presidential candidate, a 2000 Reform Party presidential nominee. One of his best books that I am a big fan of that I read is Suicide of a Superpower. What is the subtitle of that? I'm sorry. Give me a second to get this.
Yeah, I mean, while you're looking that up, I'll just say that, you said that in 2000 Pat Buchanan was the
Reform Party candidate.
Reform Party candidate,
which Donald Trump was a part of for a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say he got about 0.5% of the vote in 2000, and if you look at how much George W. Bush lost by, those people otherwise probably would have voted Republican.
Yeah.
You take, George W. Bush only lost by about 500,000 votes, whereas, Pat Buchanan got almost 450,000 votes. So those people that otherwise probably would have voted Republican, George W. Bush might have won the popular vote in 2000 without that. So that just goes to show how important the paleoconservative wing of the Republican Party is, especially how big it's grown since then.
Yeah. The book I was looking for, I don't know why I forgot this, was Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025? That had a huge influence on my thinking. It was one of the reasons why I moved away from libertarianism and have become, I'll call myself a paleoconservative at this point. I've always just called myself a nationalist. I don't think it's good to put yourself on boxes necessarily. And also it's something that even paleoconservatives say is you shouldn't be stringent to ideology and principle. You should be someone that is willing to be flexible and a pragmatist in, matters of politics. And I think that's one of the reasons why libertarians haven't been successful. They're too stringent on principle to the point that they won't even let themselves win anything. And politics is a struggle for political power. The object in play is the state. And I view politics personally as a chessboard. You have the pieces in front of you laid out, and you need to do what you need to do to achieve what you want to do. We go over all the different Senate races and all the different House races and gubernatorial races on our show. We have our own segment on the elections. People that claim to be so intellectual about conservatism or libertarianism, they would have no idea about these things. And in that sense, I don't feel like they have a true grasp on the reality of politics, and they're just more book-read. And I'm a very, I'll say a well-read person as far as political theory, but that's not the most important thing to conceive about politics. Just to go into a couple more people that I think are good paleoconservatism, or good people to look up, is John Derbyshire. I know he's a writer for VDare. I listen to his podcast every once in a while. Paul Godfrey is a good one. Russell Kirk. Peter Brimelow, I've read his book, Alien Nation. It is one of the best books ever written on the need to cut illegal immigration, but also legal immigration as well. He advocates for an entire moratorium on immigration, and extremely solid book on immigration. He wrote it in 1994. He could have a long-term view on where immigration was going to go in this country. A lot of the paleoconservatives predicted the predicament that we currently are in back in the 90s, before this stuff got really out of hand. Also, Samuel Francis is a good one. Other than that, yeah, there's no one else that I really want to say. I think also Ross Perot is kind of similar to paleoconservatives. And yeah, we also mentioned the Reform Party, and I have the platform for that. Do you want to go into some of the things on that?
Sure, you can go ahead and mention it.
We can, because, very similar to paleoconservatism, but they also have their differences. Real quick, we can go through this. Fiscal responsibility. The Reform Party supports fiscal responsibility and accountability. I think that's something we can all agree on. Tax policy. The Reform Party supports fair taxation policies without prejudice or special interest exemptions. And, that's a component of crony capitalism, where the government, picks winners and losers, which is not something that you want. And it's something that we talked about last week, in terms of the coal industry. The government should not be deciding the futures of industries. That's an absurd thing. Job creation, they supported an America First position. Personal health care. The Reform Party supports affordable and accessible health care based on informed decisions between doctors and patients. Some different things. Environmental. The Reform Party supports safeguarding our nation's natural resources balanced with the need for economic development. And this is actually something that the Paleoconservatives advocate as well, which you don't hear about, right-wing support for environmentalism. But you look at like the history of environmental groups in this country, the big one is the Sierra Club. And for the majority of their existence until recently, they advocated for stringent restrictions on immigration, both legal and illegal. There are environmental repercussions from immigration that people don't talk about. Some other things is foreign policy. They respect the sovereignty of all nations, support allies, and want fiscal responsibility. I don't think we need to get into all of these, but yeah, there's some similarities and differences, but I think the Reform Party was right on some things, and I think the Paleoconservatives are right on most things, and I don't really like the way that conservatism has changed from these viewpoints. I think we have, strayed away in ways that are important. They talk so much about capitalism, and capitalism is important, but they get so radically individualist with conservatism now, and I can see this especially with the college Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
and they're so stringent on free markets and free trade. It's just so consumerist and materialistic, and it gets away from what really matters in life. And I think the Reform Party and Paleoconservatives really understood that it's not the biggest thing in life. The nation state's way more important. The family is way more important. The general prosperity and social cohesion is more important than GDP growth.
I was going to say, do you believe that, as we said, Donald Trump pretty much is the closest thing that we've ever had as a president who is a paleoconservative?
Yeah.
And we've seen the polling about how, 59% of Trump voters see themselves as Trump voters first and members of the Republican Party second. Do you believe that a lot of people are paleoconservatives without knowing it?
Yeah, that's
or at least
something
they
I
agree
believe.
with a lot of the standpoints without actually completely understanding the platform of that wing of conservative thought?
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important that we bring this stuff out, and I want to do the episode, because I think a lot of people could realize, there is an ideological background for these things that Donald Trump advocated for that could actually be extremely useful in the way that we want to move the Republican Party. I remember it was months ago, we had a study over, Bannonism. How people view themselves as Bannonite Republicans. It's about 15% would call themselves it. But they had 4 different criteria of policy that Steve Bannon, advocated.
And you had to hit all 4 to be it. But if you looked at the people who hit 3 of 4, 2 of 4, it was a vast majority.
Yeah, I think for 3 it was around 80%. Mm-hmm. 2 it was around 90%, at least 1. 95% of Republicans supported these platforms. So I think it's important to educate these people on alternatives to what is generally pushed out there with, your Fox News basic bitch conservatism that I think really just subverts what could be a more better movement for right-wing politics in this country. And I think with that we could actually get into the section on right-wing populism that I want to get into. One of my favorite articles is on populism is Right-Wing Populism by Murray Rothbard, which is actually they call the father of modern libertarianism. And I still have respect for libertarianism in a lot of senses. I would consider myself little L, definitely not big L. The Libertarian Party is complete garbage. But Rothbard understood that libertarians are usually too deluded with their principles to actually realize we need to build coalitions to advance our principles. And he put forward in his article, Right-Wing Populism, a strategy that we can use and a platform we can use to actually find ourselves in political power. I think these are different policies that if you were to have a politician advocate for these different things, people would come to our side.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one I want to get into is slash taxes. All taxes, sales, business, property, etc., but especially the most oppressive politically and personally, the income tax. We must work towards repealing the repeal of income tax and abolition of the IRS. Now, you are someone that is way more versed in taxes than me.
Yes.
I do have a good understanding of taxes. But you understand the detriment of the income tax. In a sense, it's saying that the government owns you.
Yeah, it is.
It's saying that, your own labor, a portion of that, as condition of even living in the United States, belongs to the government. And this is something that you can't get away from. The government doesn't own you at the end of the day. And the income tax is it's an unconstitutional tax.
Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that you have a right to the product of your own labor.
Yeah.
In terms of what you are agreed to be paid with your employer or what you earn. And having some random third party come in there and be like, nope, sorry, I got to take a fifth of this from you, or a third of this from you, or half of this from you, depending on how much it is and where you earned it from. I believe the government has no right to do that.
Yeah.
Personally, myself.
And, with libertarianism, they talk about, the state is the monopoly on the legal application of force.
Right.
If I don't want to pay my taxes, someone's going to knock on my door and they'll take me to jail. When you advocate for different things, the socialists are the biggest culprits of, how we abuse taxes. They want to tax people indefinitely. You're taking a gun and saying, you're going to give up this money and we're going to give it to someone that isn't even working. We've talked about it many times before, and this also plays in the next thing, /welfare. I can read the little excerpt on this. Get rid of the underclass rule by abolishing the welfare system, or short of abolition, severely cutting and restricting it. What was the Romney quote? Like 48%?
47%.
47%. So controversial, but he was true in what he said.
He was absolutely true. And when I took a class on income taxes the semester of the election, which I guess was fall 2016, my professor even told us that. He said, look, I don't care what your politics are, but you have to understand, like, when people try to use that type of rhetoric in D.C., they're absolutely right. And we are about to reach a point where a majority of Americans do not pay taxes, and a minority of Americans do. And the majority of the Americans, through voting, will get to decide what the minority gets to do. We'll get to decide how the minority gets to be taxed. That's tyranny of the majority, the term that's often thrown around too.
And it's tyranny by people that have no skin in the system.
Exactly.
They always want to complain about the 1%, and no, they're not paying their fair share, but they're not paying any share. They're getting benefits from other people that are taxpayers. It's insane. It's really just politics motivated by envy.
It is.
And I think it's a really disgusting thing. The 1% pays something like 70% of the taxes in this country.
Yeah, the 1% pays about 50 to 60% of the taxes.
The 10% pays about 70.
No, I was going to say the 1% alone pays about 60 to 70. The top 2% pays around 80, and the top 10% pays like 95.
Yeah. So, you want to condemn the rich all you want. They're the ones that are supporting you. They are the most, productive people in society. I don't want to penalize these people. I think that's crazy. They have better decision making than the people at the bottom. I mean, I'm sorry, that's just true. Okay? The people that run the institutions in this country, they're less than 1% that can make the institutions in this country run. And we owe a lot to them. Which is why you will never find me condemning the rich.
Nope.
Okay? Yeah, there are bad rich people, but they're the ones that are making the society function. And I keep on seeing, especially online, like, trickle-down economics don't work. Have you ever been employed by a poor person? No. This is how wealth works, okay? And they want to complain about income inequality. That's not the factor that matters. It's about social mobility, okay? In everyone's lifetime, on average, 90% of Americans will make it into the top 20% of the country. Okay, it's about where you are in life. Okay, me being a 22-year-old guy, it's expected that I'm not going to have a lot of money, but in the future I will. And that's what causes these numbers in income inequality. You're taking all these people that are young and don't have assets built up, they don't have a career, so it's to be expected you're going to have these things.
What you should be doing is comparing people in that exact same, area.
Yeah.
If you have two different people that are both 22-year-old college students, unemployed, compare where they are in life. That's what you should be comparing if you're going to compare anything else to quote-unquote income inequality. But if you're comparing some rich CEO to some, unemployed college kid, of course you're going to find income inequality. And if you do that across the board. So, I personally believe there is no such thing as income inequality because there's no such thing as a finite amount of wealth.
Yeah.
It's not like there is a set number of dollars out there. And for every dollar a rich person earns means it's being taken away potentially by some poor person. That is not how things work at all.
And the word income inequality, it sounds all nice, but the push for equality is just the push for socialism and inevitably communism.
And what's even worse is it's a push for equality of outcome.
Yes.
Not an equality of
opportunity.
Exactly, an equality opportunity. If you look at a sports analogy, you have a level playing field in regards to the scores. Both teams play this by the same rules. If a team is caught cheating, fine, penalize them. But if both teams are playing by the same rules, someone is going to win, someone is going to lose. There's going to be teams that are going to go on to win the championship, and some teams are going to barely struggle to win even 5 games.
Yeah.
And that's the way it works. And you have to understand that, your situation may suck, but you put your heart and mind into it, and you can improve that. And it's not the rich people's fault that you're there.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's your fault that you're there. Don't get me wrong. But it's not the rich people's fault.
Yeah. It's crazy that, they can point to the 1% and say they're exploiting you, even though you're exploiting them. You're taking money from them and putting it to yourself. And, that's why we do need to get rid of the welfare state drastically, okay? We put people in a mindset where they can just live off of welfare almost indefinitely. We have a big subset of the nation that is okay not even working and wanting to live off the productivity of others. That's extremely unjust.
And what I find even worse is go back to that Mitt Romney quote. Those people have the exact same voting power as you do. And a lot of times those people, they do outbreed richer people.
They're breeding subsidized by welfare. It's essentially eugenic or dysgenic.
They literally are subsidized to breed. Those people have 4 or 5 kids, and they get paid welfare for the more kids they have. The more kids they have, the more money from the government they get. Whereas middle class and rich people are the type of people who have a mindset of, I can't afford a kid right now. I'm going to wait it off until I have the money. Okay, I'm only going to have 1 or 2 kids. Meanwhile, someone over there is having 3, 4, 5 children, getting paid by the government to do it, whereas the people who are productive in society are waiting to have kids, having less kids because they know they can't afford it, because they want to raise their kids with their own money that they have because they know they can't afford it otherwise. And what happens is those people who are, being subsidized to breed, go on, they will outnumber you in the voting pool.
Yes.
And they will vote to tax you more. They will vote for bigger government. Whereas productive members of society, people who have less kids, middle-class type people, they don't support bigger government. They don't support higher taxes.
They will vote to oppress you, and they will be the death of the middle class in this country. Yes, they are winning.
And they are winning. We have seen that. Hillary Clinton got, 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did. There's a reason because of that.
It's very close right now, and this is not a sustainable thing for the future.
I mean, this is kind of a controversial thing that I've said on the show before. I personally don't believe that everyone should have the right to vote.
Yeah.
And I think you agree with me there.
You should only be able to vote if you are a net taxpayer, in my opinion.
And we've looked at the
statistics. You need to have something... You need to have skin in the game.
And we've looked at the statistics. If only taxpayers voted, Donald Trump would have won California.
Yes.
If only taxpayers voted. I think, what was it, Vermont was, the only state that he would have lost if that was the case or something like that?
He would have had something over 400 electoral votes.
Yeah, or it was something, maybe not in Vermont, the only state, but yeah, he would have won California, okay? The last time a Republican won California was 1988.
Yeah. And like I said before, welfare... It's the most dysgenic program that's ever existed. Like we said, it's subsidizing the breeding of people that make bad decisions. Okay, IQ is generally considered about 80 to 90% heritable to your next generation. And, IQ is the biggest definer of how you will succeed in life. This is just how it works. We want the rich to be having more children, okay? So then their high IQ will pass along to their next generation. I'm sorry that maybe this is so controversial, but it just makes sense to me, okay?
Personally, for me, the last thing that I would want is low IQ people who do not contribute to society outbreeding the productive members of society.
Yeah.
Because, you look at how bad things are now with welfare systems. Imagine where it's going to be 20, 30 years from now, when those people outnumber you by twice as much as they do currently.
Yeah, and collective IQ is an extremely important factor, which people don't want to talk about. But you look at our great wave of immigration back around, the 1920s that we had with the great expanse of European immigration. Our collective IQ, and it goes over this in the book Conservative by Vox Day, extremely good book on immigration. Our collective IQ went up something like 6 points. That is really substantial.
For a collective IQ of an entire nation, yes.
Yes. So you look at what happened, though, after the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, because we allowed the entire third world to come in, our collective IQ has dropped around 4 or 5 points. That is extremely huge as well. And, that's, going to have a huge impact on our economy. Our entire future is dependent on having smart people. It's frustrating, but, it's something that needs to be said. Let's go into the next thing that Rothbard advocates, and that is the abolition of racial and group privileges. Abolish affirmative action, set aside racial quotas, etc., and point out that the root of such quotas is the entire civil rights structure, which tramples on the property rights of every American. And this goes into what I said before, our freedom of association. Okay, through enforced practices. We don't get to have decisions around our own businesses by having enforced diversity quotas or enforced affirmative action. It's taking people that aren't as qualified and forcing them upon businesses. And, you have a couple of people that aren't qualified for a business that can destroy a business, like you said with the simulation. I've heard the story from you before. Didn't they, eventually let along some people that were business majors that just didn't fit the culture?
Yes, precisely. After 1 year of the 4 guys who were picked not because of their skills, but they were picked because of the type of people they were. After, about a year of them working there, they decided to do another round of hiring, but they changed up the type of person they wanted. On paper, the new people should have been better at their jobs than the current people, but that's not what happened. They didn't fit the company culture, and within 6 months, that entire branch office was shut down, and he had to move back to Iowa. Within 6 months, and he'd been working there for over a year.
It doesn't take a lot, and if you're someone that wants to see business growth, this is something you want to do. And if you are, generally conservative, someone on the right that wants government to get out of the way, this is a facet that you want the government to get out of the way. This is intrusion on business decisions. And, also a bad way that this affects the nation is, affirmative action and racial quotas for colleges. Okay? People don't talk about this, but white people are highly, affected by this in extremely negative ways, to the point to where there's a lot of colleges where they only make up 40% of the population, which, their representation across the country, and generally in Ivy Leagues I'm just talking about, but they only constitute around 40%, when as a representative of the nation they're around 70%. So that's some drastic inequality there, but it's, said in the justification of, this is for racial equality, this is good, you need to disadvantage future generations of whites to help all these different minorities. I haven't seen a study where that actually has ever happened.
I don't think it has, that's the point.
And just positive discrimination is inherently unjust. You're punishing people collectively for things that they never did. Okay, I was born in 1995. I'm not responsible for slavery. I'm not responsible for Jim Crow. Why should I be disadvantaged? It's crazy. Any other things on that we need to go into?
I think we pretty much hit the nail on the head with all we were going to talk about in terms of like affirmative action, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, let's go into the next thing that Rothbard advocates for, and this is one that I think something we definitely need to do, and that is take back the streets, crush criminals. And by this I mean, of course, not white-collar criminals or insider traders, but violent street criminals, robbers, muggers, rapists, murderers. Cops must be unleashed and allowed to administer instant punishment, subject, of course, to liability when they are in error. And this is something that I think people don't realize is heavily under assault. The police's ability to do their own goddamn job.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've especially seen this with the big rise of Black Lives Matter. You look at all these people that they try to hold up: Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, people that were committing crimes. Okay, hands up, don't shoot was a lie. That's a myth, and they still chant that.
It's the biggest lie of 2014.
Yeah, it's a false narrative, and they still chant that to this day. They want to make them a privileged class that is allowed to commit crimes. It's crazy, but this is a common Democrat platform, and it doesn't do anyone any good. Okay, especially minorities. They have to live in these neighborhoods. Okay, you look back at, say, drug laws in the 90s. African Americans were actually some of the biggest advocates for this because they saw what drugs were doing to their communities. Now, I'm not against, you know, the legalization of marijuana, but other drugs, yeah. And, you know, like I said, crime is generally affecting the poorest people in your society. You want to clear out these criminals, clear out the no-go zones for violent gangs, and, make criminals fear the punishment of the police.
And one of the biggest problems, I mean, this kind of has a lot to do with it, is like the drug war, you know? Because obviously we know that, you know, poor people are at most at risk to be doing that type of stuff.
Drug abuse.
What it does is it creates perpetual behavior. You know, you have a person who, like, you know, is like, I don't know, 18, 20 years old, and, you know, they're already poor, they have a hard time getting a job. So what do? They turn to, like, drugs, drug dealing, that sort of stuff. They get busted, they go to jail, they now have a criminal record. You can't get a job with that. You have no future if you don't have a job.
Yeah.
You can't be, like I was saying before, like a productive member of society. So what do? You turn back to drugs. You get involved with gangs. And that leads to violence. That leads to more drugs. It leads to more arrests. It leads to more crime. And you see this over and over and over and over in the poorest of communities all across the country. It is a perpetual cycle that, you know, a lot of it is created because of drug enforcement. But a lot of it also has to do with the other factors that we were mentioning before.
Incentive structures.
Yeah.
Which also plays into how people behave under welfare. You know, tax is one of the big things on incentive structures, which, you know, how we've been repealing under, you know, Trump regulations. That's why the economy is doing pretty well right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's one of the biggest fallacies that's out there, is people believe that the purpose of taxation is to fund the government. That is a secondary focus. The main focus is to drive people's behavior.
Yes.
There's a reason why certain states will, like, offer tax benefits for things. Like, look at the state of Louisiana, okay? How, as a percent, I should say, states of Louisiana and Georgia. 20 years ago, if I told you that half of Hollywood movies that are being made were filmed in Louisiana and Georgia, would you believe me?
No.
No, you'd think that most are filmed like California or New York, which used to be true. But states like that have offered tax benefits, tax breaks, to say, hey, come film in our states. And you're seeing, like, watch the credits of every movie that comes out. You'll see things like filmed in Georgia, filmed in Louisiana, because tax benefits allow them to do that. It's cheaper to do that than it is California. You know, look at the show Breaking Bad. One of the most popular TV shows ever made. Took place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, filmed on location. It was originally supposed to take place in the Los Angeles area. But instead, the state of New Mexico said, hey, we're going to offer you some benefits, some tax benefits to come film here. And what did it turn into? It turned into a tourism explosion. Literally, if you go onto the Albuquerque, New Mexico website under the tourism section, there's literally a Breaking Bad tab. Say, here's the filming locations, here's a map, go see it.
Last spring break, I went to New Mexico by myself, and I went to Albuquerque, and I went to the art museum that they have there. I forget which one. There's a lot of art museums in New Mexico in general. But, they had an entire section on, like, films and TV shows done in New Mexico, and this is all, as I said, incentive structure.
Yeah.
And, that incentive structure also plays with criminality, okay? If people fear punishment, they're going to stop doing things. This is also, plays into illegal immigration. It's down a ton just because people fear the punishment of Donald Trump, just because he's someone that's saying he's tough on this. You have to be tough on these criminals, okay? There's no excuse, and we need to get out of the way of the police. Like Rothbard says, unleash the police. We need to take back our streets. We live in, a first world nation. We shouldn't have problems like this.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next one. Number 5, take back the streets. Get rid of the bums. Again, unleash the cops to clear the streets of bums and vagrants. Where will they go? Who cares? Hopefully they will disappear. That is, move from the ranks of the petted and cosseted bums classes to the ranks of productive members of society. Again, we want to force people to become productive. It's oppressive that people have to be pulled down by the underclass of the society. I'm sorry, but you can destroy a nation by encouraging this kind of behavior. And we need to be tough on these things.
Now, is that referring to, like, homelessness?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I know, we're not too far from Austin. Austin has a terrible homeless problem.
And, I've talked to a lot of those people. They do it through choice, okay? A lot of them, they call it a lifestyle. They just don't want to work. They'd rather be begging. Some people, yeah, they're there through misfortune. But a lot aren't. Okay? That's the God-honest truth on this stuff. Let's go into the next one, though. Number 6, abolish the Fed, attack the bankers. Money and banking are recondite issues, but the realities can be made vivid. The Fed is an organized cartel of banksters who are creating inflation, ripping off the public, destroying the savings of the average American. The hundreds of billions of taxpayer handouts to S&L banksters will be chicken feed compared to the coming collapse of the commercial banks. And, this is what Ron Paul said. I actually started reading Ron Paul's book, End the Fed. I'm only like 15 pages in. But, the Federal Reserve is an unconstitutional institution. Our founding fathers were highly against centralized banking. Andrew Jackson's last thing he said on his dying deathbed is, I defeated the banks. The Federal Reserve is not a part of the federal government. It is a private institution that is allowed to create the money of our country through thin air. Okay, we got off the gold standard, which, reeled in the mass inflation that we've had through the last century. Okay, and it's not something that's sustainable indefinitely, and we're debt slaves to the Federal Reserve. They charge us interest on money that they make out of thin air. We don't need to be doing this. And, if we force banks to actually have some sort of responsibility in banking, we didn't have central banks, they have to compete. They actually, have to have some fiscal responsibility in how they hand out loans. And in the long run, if we do that, we'll have a much more financially secure banking system, a long-term, more prosperous banking system, because they won't be doing willy-nilly things, so they actually have, returns on their investments, which will give us more capital to give out. And, the Federal Reserve is pretty goddamn terrible. And they do backroom deals which aren't accountable to the public. And these have some of the biggest effects on the nation.
Yeah, and you had mentioned about how banks actually having what was the phrase you would use? They have basically punishments for bad behavior, bad actions.
Yeah, there needs to be repercussions.
Yes, there absolutely does. But fiscal irresponsibility of banks is part of the reason why we had the entire subprime mortgage crisis.
Yeah,
back in 2007, 2008. And I'm not saying that was completely created by the Federal Reserve, but that was a byproduct of that being there.
And who paid the bill for their who paid the bill for their negligence?
The taxpayers, the half of the country.
To the tune of like $1 trillion.
Over $1 trillion.
Over $1
if you look at the multiple different things that were done. I mean, we at that time they passed, like the stimulus bill or the omnibus bill or whichever one it was referring to.
The omnibus?
At the time, whichever was the one that the first one they passed.
Yeah.
It's like $850 billion one-time thing. At that time, that was the most money the government had ever spent on one time on a thing. And it was like all over the news. And nowadays, it's like, $850 billion, that's Trump change. And that's just like in 10 years. It's amazing how fast things change like that.
Would you mind if I read a column from Ron Paul on ending the Fed?
Yeah, go right ahead.
This is To Make America Really Great Again, End the Fed, written by Ron Paul on November 17th, 2016. Former Dallas Federal Reserve Bank President Richard Fisher recently gave a speech identifying the Federal Reserve's easy money, low interest rate policies as a source of the public anger that propelled Donald Trump into the White House. Mr. Fisher is certainly correct that the Fed's policies have skewed the middle class. However, the problem is not specific Fed policies, but the very system of fiat currency managed by a selective central bank. Federal Reserve generated increases in money supplies cause economic inequality. This is because when the Fed acts to increase the money supply, well-to-do investors and other crony capitalists are the first recipients of new money. These economic elites enjoy an increase in purchasing power before the Fed's inflationary policies lead to mass price increases. This gives them boosts to their standard of living. By the time the increased money supply trickles down to the middle and working class Americans, the economy is already beset by inflation. So the average American sees their standard of living decline as a result of Fed-engaged money supply increases. Some Fed defenders claim that inflation doesn't negatively affect anyone's standard of living because price increases are matched by wage increases. This claim ignores the fact that the effects of the Fed's actions depend on how individuals react to the Fed's actions. Historically, an increase in money supply does not just cause a general rise in prices. It also causes money to flow into specific sectors, creating a bubble that provides investors and workers in those areas a temporary increase in their income. Meanwhile, the workers and investors in sectors not affected by the Fed generated booms will see a decline in their purchasing power and thus their standard of living. Adoption of a rules-based monetary policy will not eliminate the problems of Fed-created bubbles, booms, and busts, since Congress cannot set a rule dictating how individuals react to Fed policies. The only way to eliminate the boom and bust cycle is to remove the Fed's power to increase the money supply and manipulate interest rates. I'm not going to read all of it, but yeah, that goes into pretty good detail in a pretty short amount of time why the Fed is pretty terrible. And he talks about, inflation causes price to rise, but some people believe, wages will increase. We haven't seen significant wage increases in this country in the last 40 or 50 years. So when you let inflation go unchecked, it's gonna hurt people's standard of living immensely, and it can eventually lead to the absolute collapse of the entire financial system and the economy. Similar to things we saw in 2008, but it can be way worse.
And I feel like, eventually we will reach that point, The
way things are moving, sadly.
I don't think that it will happen, If you would have asked me a couple of years ago, I probably would have told you we're 3 to 5 years out. At this point, I do have a slightly more optimistic viewpoint on things. I still think maybe we're 10 to 15 years out from a complete total collapse of the system, but I do believe it is coming. I do think that, whether or not Donald Trump actually has anything to do with it, that has been pushed back a bit by some of his pro-growth policies. Now, keep in mind, the Federal Reserve has already raised interest rates twice under his presidency. They're thinking about doing it again in December. Now, the last thing they want is complete chaos or a collapse, because that doesn't help the Fed at all either. So they do kind of have a little bit of skin in their game to try to keep things under control. Theoretically, though, if they wanted to crash Trump's economy, they easily could by raising interest rates too high too fast, which obviously we don't want to have happen. The one thing that I think is keeping them from doing that is the fact that, people believe that when Donald Trump was elected, if he was to have the economic growth that people thought he was going to have, which he is having, you know, they said, okay, along with this is going to come high inflation rates. Problem is, we haven't seen that yet. It's almost, unbelievable how much the economy is growing at the rate it's been growing without subsequent increases in inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation's been kept low.
Artificially,
and I don't even know why inflation has been. I would have expected high inflation rates. I really would have. But, we haven't had it.
Which was kind of to make Obama's quote-unquote recovery seem like it was happening, but it really didn't.
Oh, no. I mean, the recovery that Obama did have was just like, if anything, the economy, it recovered despite Obama, not because of him.
It was the slowest growth of GDP in a president's entire, in the entire terms that they've ever served. Obama never even reached 3% GDP growth, which is usually what you want to see for your country to have a sustainable future. We actually had, some points, negative 2.7 we saw around 2009 and 2010.
Yeah, when he first came into office, when it was still being bad.
Yeah.
Before it started to slowly improve.
It's ridiculous, but, a lot of this was just through arbitrary Federal Reserve policies. And if we didn't have the Federal Reserve, we could have fixed the problem quicker than we ever had.
Yeah, and keep in mind the Federal Reserve kept the interest rate at pretty much zero all of Obama's presidency.
Yeah.
We've never seen that before.
And it just printed off the mass stimulus that he wanted out of thin air, and then indebted future generations, which is slavery to the future generations that had to eventually try and pay this stuff off.
And plus, when you look at things like quantitative easing, which is part of the reason why the stock market did, improve under the Obama years, whereas the Trump, boom that we've seen in the stock market is because of, pro-growth policies and a positive economic outlook. A lot of people think that the current stock market rise is because of Barack Obama, which is, the people who are saying that are leftists who don't understand how economics work to begin with, let alone the fact that, if you do understand these things, you understand that, you realize that. And yeah, the stock market did do great the last few years of Barack Obama. A lot of that was because of quantitative easing. A lot of it was because of the fact that the Federal Reserve kept interest rates near zero to try to increase the money supply, to try to get people to invest in the in the stock market, try to get that stuff up. That's the reason why it went high. And now you're seeing the Federal Reserve is saying, okay, we can start to raise interest rates again. Eventually it will collapse. Like I said, I don't think it's going to collapse as fast as I previously had thought, simply because, things have changed. But that being said, I do believe that's still coming eventually.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next thing Rothbard advocates for, and that is America First. A key point, and not meant to be seventh in priority, the American economy is not only in recession, it is stagnating. And this is an article I wrote in 1992, let me remind you. Is not only in recession, it is stagnating. The average of American family is worse off now than it was 2 decades ago. Come home, America. Stop supporting bums abroad. Stop all foreign aid, which is aid to banksters and their bonds and their export industries. Stop globaloney. And let's solve our problems at home. And, this was the big thing that Donald Trump, supported through the campaign. He hasn't been the best at actually upholding this, and I kind of knew that was going to happen, sadly. But, yeah, we need America first. And it's crazy that there's so many politicians that see America First as a vulgar term.
The left sees it as racist.
Yeah. I've, even like people, because, who is the guy that had the party? America First is a term that existed prior to World War II. God, who's the guy that flew across the Atlantic?
God, it's the name's Stark. The name is, it's escaping right now. I should know this.
Yeah. Whatever.
Yeah,
but because look it up for me. But because America First was an idea, people wanted to stay out of World War II, we're not allowed to even use the term today.
Howard Hughes?
Howard Hughes?
Or are you thinking of the other one?
Charles Lindbergh.
There you go.
Charles Lindbergh. He was in charge of a political movement at the time that advocated for political or America First, trying to stay out of the Second World War. And now it's still held against us, seen as anti-Semitic, that we'd want to prioritize our own interests, to be non-interventionists, to not take part in globalistic policies, not wanting to be part of the United Nations. It's crazy. And one of the big things, as we said before, under paleoconservatism, is we're an empire. We have over 800 bases internationally in more than 70 countries. And I want to go over some of the different things that is involved in, having troops abroad. We have around 80,000 troops installed in 350 military installments in Europe. We have more than 154,000 active duty troops stationed in bases in Asia. If we brought them all home, we'd be no more or less safe than we generally are now, and it would be better for our economy not to be spending money abroad. Okay, one of the big things that Trump railed against was NATO's not paying their fair share. Okay, Germany has one of the best economies in the world, and they don't have a large military because we pretty much pay for the military of Germany. That doesn't make sense, okay? This is not our problem. This is something you can deal with. Okay, another thing is the deterrence effect of having all these bases is overrated. You look at, we currently have all these presences in Europe. It's seen as to try and deter Russian military aggression, but interventions in places like Georgia and Ukraine derive more from Russian insecurities about the expansion of U.S. led Western economic and military institutions than from signs of American weakness or insignificant military presence in Eastern Europe. Okay, you look at a map, and this is one of the things, the whole Russia thing's a joke. We know that. And we wanted better relations with Russia, which is not going to happen the way politics are right now. We encircle Russia. All of the borders are encircled by Russia right now with American bases. Of course they feel insecure right now. Okay? It's causing them to try and expand their military because they feel like we're going to invade them. And if Hillary Clinton was our president, there's a better chance that we would be at war with Russia right now. It's crazy. The next thing I want to go into is our bases abroad encourage resentment. Local resentment over the presence of foreign military bases can linger for generations, as was the case when in 1991 the Philippine Senate, quote, assailed the U.S. military presence as a vestige of colonialism and an affront to Philippine sovereignty. The president, Corazon C. Aquino, ordered full withdrawal. And just last year, back in June, Japan, 65,000 Okinawans protested in the streets against the U.S. presence there. Sometimes such resentments can be extreme. According to the Chicago University's Robert Papp, quote, the principal cause of suicide terrorism is resistance to foreign occupation. Having all of our bases in all these different countries makes people resent us because we're occupying them. It's causing more terrorism in the world. It's causing issues with countries that we see as allies. It's insane.
I will actually disagree with here slightly. And the exception to that rule is European countries.
Yeah.
Because in general, European countries do like the fact that we have bases there. In fact, a lot of them protested before that we brought bases there, but after we started installing them, especially in Germany and in Great Britain, they like us there. They don't want us to leave. They actually protest us trying to even talk about closing those down. The reason why is because a lot of the times, you have a lot of people in like a German town that are unemployed. You stick a U.S. military base by there, all of a sudden you're bringing 10, 20,000 U.S. troops there. And you're creating, hundreds if not thousands of new jobs for the German citizens in the area in many, many different industries. Construction, general, work in like hospitals, work in businesses around there. Because if you're bringing 20,000 people that are, by being U.S. military, they have a guaranteed income. That they have a certain culture amongst them to where they're not going to probably meet out their, starting gangs, getting in fights, getting drunk, causing crime, those people actually benefit. Those cities and the areas around there greatly benefit for U.S. military bases being there. But like I said, that is very, that is for European countries that we have bases. You look at actual other bases, like forward operating bases, especially in the Middle East, huge resentment from the population.
Yeah.
You look at U.S. military bases in Asian countries, lots of resentment from the local populations. Not so much in South Korea and Japan, but
well, in Okinawa, though.
Okinawa, but I'm saying like mainland Japan.
Yeah.
We have a base in Tokyo there. South Korea likes the fact that we have bases there. They don't want us to leave there. Most of the other countries that we do have bases in that area, they do resent the fact that we are there. They don't want us there.
But also, like Japan, okay, we subsidize their military too.
Right.
And they're an extremely well-off economic country. There's no need to do this. Let me go into the last point I want to make on kind of our, bases overseas, and then I want to go into some foreign aid stuff.
Right.
The last thing I wanted to go into is they risk entangling us in unnecessary wars. U.S. bases often cause officials to urge American interventions wherever conflict might break out, but this risk entangling us in foreign wars that are none of our own business. If conflict breaks out over maritime or territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas, the U.S. may be obligated to intervene against China to fill its security guarantees to Taiwan, Japan, or the Philippines. Getting into a war with China over some uninhabited rocks of no strategic importance to us is not in our interests. Before the nuclear deal with Iran, there was apparently a real risk Israel would preventively strike one of Iran's nuclear facilities. Because of American promises to fight for Israel, U.S. bases in Bahrain would have been a priority target in Iranian retaliatory strikes. This would have brought us into another desperate quagmire in the Middle East, which is frankly the last thing we need. So yeah, when we have all these bases abroad, of course there's going to be a higher risk of fighting. People don't want troops at their borders. It's crazy. This is not stuff we can afford at this point. We saw the effects of Iraq. We know what the effects of Afghanistan are. There's money we can't get back, and we just can't afford this stuff. It's not worth the lives. It's not worth the money. But I want to, unless you have any words on that,
no, I didn't have
I want to
anything
go into some foreign aid numbers. Another thing, part of America First, is getting rid of foreign aid. As of fiscal year 2017, foreign aid between the U.S. State Department and USAID totaled $50.1 billion. We could build 2 walls with that money. Why are we sending taxpayer dollars to people abroad? Shouldn't it be spent on American citizens? And, you look at how they break that down. We give away $10.5 billion in military assistance. And you know who receives the biggest amount of that money?
Israel and Afghanistan?
Israel and Afghanistan. We spend something like 3.4. Here, can you actually look up the exact numbers on Israel for me?
Oh yeah, I've actually got it up right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So which year did you say you wanted here?
Just say yearly what it is.
Okay, yearly what it is. Israel, we give $3.1 billion in foreign aid money.
And Israel's economy is pretty strong.
It's
not.
Extremely strong.
It's a first world nation. Why are we subsidizing their military? Okay, they always say Israel's our greatest ally. They're pretty parasitic to us. And this is one of the things that Pat Buchanan was extremely critical of. And that is our relations with Israel, which is, one of the things we, criticize on the Sunday show fairly often. Not too often, but, you look at how the GOP is now and the Republican Party. They're so in love with Israel. And it's not good for us at all. It doesn't make sense. And a lot of that has to do with Christianity and, whatever. But it's just not good for the country. I don't know. And, just last year, we passed a new bill to send more foreign aid, military aid to Israel. I believe it was over the next 10 years, we're going to give them $30 billion. And you want to know how the Senate voted on that?
It's like 98-2 or 98-0. 100 to
It
nothing.
was 100-0.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that our political system can all agree on to vote for, is sending more military aid to Israel. It's crazy. This is the effect of the Israel lobby over us and how it impacts many different things like our foreign policy.
I mean, look at, AIPAC. Almost every single member of Congress goes to AIPAC every single year. And that's for both parties. Everybody does it.
And, you look at the different influences that Israel's had on the neoconservative branch of the Republican Party. As I said before, the Project for a New American Century was a neoconservative think tank that had heavy ties to Israel that caused us to get into Iraq. Okay, you look at George Bush was elected, they were looking for reasons to go into Iraq. Iraq wasn't a threat to us. It's insane. Let's go into the last thing that Rothbard says, and we've actually been going for quite a while, but I think we've been saying a lot of pretty good stuff, so I don't mind.
I think so as well.
The last thing that Rothbard got into was defend family values, which means get the state out of the family and replace state control with parental control. In the long run, this means ending public schools and replacing them with private schools. But we must realize that vouchers and even tax credit schemes are not, despite Milton Friedman, transitional demands on the path to privatizing education. Instead, they will make matters worse by fastening government control more totally upon the private schools. Within the sound alternative is decentralization and back to local, community, and neighborhood controls of the schools. Now, one of the things that people don't understand about how the American system with public education works is we are way overpaying for public education. Okay? How it currently stands, we spend double what it usually costs to, educate a child, what it does privately in the public sense. We spend what per child through, public education, the kind of money that would pay for like an elite school to go to, like an elite private school. And, the federal government is super inefficient as it is. And someone that, as myself, has taught in public schools at the high school level, I was just teaching elementary school today, we could do so much better. And this is not... Okay, you look at the Department of Education, that's a very recent invention. Okay, it's something that's not necessary. And isn't it Thomas Massey or Justin Amash?
That did what?
That's drafting the bill to get rid of the Department of Education altogether.
I think it was Thomas Massey.
Thomas Massey. This is not something we need. Okay, we can fulfill the same tasks that the Department of Education does with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Justice Department. And, having federal intrusion in, education has been detrimental to us extremely. You look at under Bush, we had the No Child Left Behind, which essentially put the blame on teachers for children having bad test scores.
Not only that, but, when I was in high school, and I don't know if this is the same for you, but I was in all AP classes. And it was amazing how no matter where the students that I was friends with that are in those classes were at, no matter how we stood politically with each other, which, a lot of them were liberals and Democrats, and a lot were conservatives and Republicans as well, every single one of us agreed that No Child Left Behind was one of the worst pieces of legislation ever passed. Because what it did was it did not, pick up and carry the weaker students to try to pick them up. Instead, it dragged down the smarter students. And that's what we all understood, that as the smarter students. And the people in other classes wouldn't understand that. They wouldn't get that because they didn't feel the effects of it. But the smarter students, the ones who are more advanced, they're the ones who are being dragged down from No Child Left Behind. Just, throwing that out there.
Yeah, and Rothbard, wants to see the abolition of public education in general. I don't know how I feel about that so much, but we do need to see a drastic decentralization of education. things like Common Core have had extremely detrimental, costs on education. It's highly unpopular, and how public education stands right now, they're indoctrination factories to, the leftists that teach in them. And as someone that, has been in these environments with teachers, like, I've seen this stuff firsthand. I understand this stuff. It's not good. And, the free market, for much less, can teach these people so much more. We see this with homeschooling. It's so much more successful than public education. And that's just learning from their parents. You can set up homeschooling, associations in neighborhoods where people decide to teach different, as a neighborhood, they decide to teach the children collectively there. And, you look at how they do in colleges and whatnot, and their preparedness to actually go to college, they're way more prepared to go than the average public school student. And I don't know, Rothbard, he's kind of against, vouchers and stuff, which, I mean, we have seen success with voucher programs. But
it's a step in the right direction.
It is, and it would allow us to expand the market on building private schools, because there would be a huge influx in money to send people's children to private schools. And we can change the structures of how we actually do public education. You could, instead of having elementary school and middle school and high school, you could just do it all in the same building. You could change it to where, we have problems with, in public education, we have too many children oftentimes in classrooms. You can have 25, 30 children. You could bring it down to private education to where maybe there's only 4 kids. Maybe you just do tutors for your child. Let the parents choose this. Okay, the people that are against school choice, they want to keep children in failing schools. Pretty much deciding their destiny for them and how they learn. It's, as someone that's a teacher, usually teachers are liberals and advocate for the state and unions, but, I'm highly against public education, and as someone that works in public education, because I just know that private schools have done a much better job at doing this. I felt like I had another thing to say about public education, but it left me. Do you have anything else?
Well, I was just going to say, I think we should, in talking about public education, it would be a good idea to bring up Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, because she gets a lot of flack for not being the biggest supporter of public education.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of people have been, either indoctrinated to believe, or they just do believe that, it's the government's responsibility to teach everybody. And if you deny funding, or if you cut funding, or if you change even any little thing, then what you're doing is you're like taking away education of people, and you want people to be dumber, you want people to be not as smart. When obviously, that's, as we said, you have firsthand experience, that's not exactly the case. That's not the case at all. And so, I think we were talking about how a couple of weeks ago, I think we talked about this on the show, to where they were changing some policy to try to give more power back to the states and local governments to run their own education systems, to try to take away power from the federal government. Like, this is literally, people don't think that the government will actually get rid of itself, but like, we are kind of seeing that to a slight degree. The Department of Education literally gave a lot of its power back to the states and to local levels to run education systems, because you have someone in there who believes that it's not entirely the government's responsibility to, educate, or a more appropriate word would be to indoctrinate your children. It should be up to the parents, or up to, local communities to do that, not the federal government.
Yeah, and, this is a place where, as I said, I kind of disagree with Rothbard. I think school voucher programs and tax credits for education are pretty good ideas, because, in my opinion, if you allow the market to actually have some sort of, increase in funding to actually build these new schools and allow these new private education systems to, establish themselves, then you could actually have the infrastructure to where you'll have these private schools and you can move away from public schools. And, people always believe like, if you start school choice, you're going to hurt the kids in public education. That's actually not the case, because if you allow people to choose and say a number of kids leave your high school and they're going to do private education, they're going to be homeschooled or whatever, you're lowering the classroom sizes for these people in public school. So you could actually have a higher focus for the teachers to teach these students.
Not only that, but, I tend to have the belief that the students who would be the first to go, in terms of the first to leave going to, private schools or going to, or becoming homeschooled, tend to be the type of students who are smarter already. Yeah. I guess if I could use that term, it's probably not the best way.
They're being held back by public education.
Yeah, they are being held back. That's like I was saying with not Don't Ask, Don't Tell, with No Child Left Behind. Those students, if those are the first to go, what happens is, when I was in high school, I was part of the students, the principal student advisory board. Now, this wasn't like student council. This was literally like handpicked students throughout the 10 students or 10 to 15 students, handpicked throughout the school to personally meet with the principal to say, what can we do to make this school better? We met like once a month. To this day, I don't even know why I was chosen, but they saw something in me that they thought I would have good input on that. And I did that for the final 2 years. And I still have that on my resume. But one of the things that he specifically said to us when we were trying to determine different ways of teaching or different ways that teachers can teach to make people learn better is he said, I know that none of what we're talking about here applies to any of you. Because all of you, I could throw you out there and you could teach yourselves. You don't even need to go to school.
Yeah.
And he specifically told us that. So what happens is you're taking the students who, you're literally wasting resources on them. You really are. You're wasting your resources on teaching the higher level students. I hate to say it, but that is true.
Yeah.
Because they don't need it. Okay? What they need is something that's, tailored to them.
It's mean, but they're held down by the peers.
Yeah, they are being held down. And so you are setting them free.
Yeah.
To make their own decisions or have their parents make their own decisions. Because if you're a parent of a smart kid, you know what's best for them, okay? And if you know that, you can tell whether or not the school system is working for them or not. And so by letting them go free and focus your resources on the people who actually need it, students who actually need development, students who actually need different areas of education to be focused on, if you can direct your resources appropriately, you can make it better for everybody. So I completely agree with you that this fallacy is out there that, if you start doing this, it's going to hurt public schools. No, it's going to help every single student is what's going to end up happening.
And, there's a lot of instances where you see, in inner cities, where people have opportunities to get into charter schools, and they do that through lotteries. And these, poor people, they understand that, their schools are failing them. They're these harbingers of gangs and drugs and whatnot. And they put all their hope in even getting to these charter schools because they know that's actually, the only path for the child to have any success. And, people celebrate and people cry depending on the results of those, lotteries. I don't really want that for them. I want them to all have the opportunity to go to a school that's actually good for them. Okay? And, I get from leftists that, we don't need to do this kind of stuff. We just need to throw more money into education. Some of the biggest schools that are failing us are schools that we throw $16,000, $20,000, $25,000 into students. It doesn't cost that much to teach kids. It's just that the American public education system's broken. And another thing is just as you said, school is not practical for a lot of people. I learned most of the stuff I know on my own.
Same here.
And a lot of kids, they're not fit to go through school, okay? Maybe it's good for them to learn the basics and read and whatnot, but they should be pushed into different vocational schools to actually learn skills that'll be good for them. Not everyone is smart enough to go to college, okay? These people, it'll be the best of them. They can learn a skill where they can get out of high school or, by the time they're 18 or whatever, and actually have a job that makes $60,000 a year. And you can do that with plumbing or being an electrician or being a carpenter. And I wish I really knew more about that in college, because now I'm saddled with a lot of debt and we're all pushed to the idea of like, oh, we're just all going to go to college.
I mean, our generation was sold on a lie.
Yeah.
That is the truth. We were sold on this lie that you go to college, you're going to get a good job, you're going to have a great career. Everybody in our generation knows that's not true.
Yeah.
And that's why, you're looking at like Generation Z coming up here. A lot of them don't want to go to college.
And I taught high school. Like I talk to kids about their futures, and like some kids are eager to go to college, but I honestly say to them, like, do be careful about this decision, because you may regret this, because I regret the decision that I made. I'm very honest about that. In the long term, you'll be happy if you just get a job where you're making a lot of money, you didn't go to college, you got this stuff without any debt, and you can just go on and have a family. Because how it is for me, I have a lot of debt, and I'm not actually going to a field that makes a ton of money, and I've delayed myself all these different years. I'm going to have to put off having a family years down the line that I wouldn't have done so if I actually had practical skills. And that's the God honest truth. I'm a smart person, but I made bad decisions, but it's because, and it's also on me, but I was pushed towards something that wasn't good for me. Okay, I thought college was going to be a bastion of intellectualism, but every single week on the Sunday show, we go through current year college crisis. That's not the case with college.
Yeah.
It really isn't. American colleges are a joke. And, we fill them up because we have the subsidized government grants and federal aid and whatnot. We fill them up with people that shouldn't be there. I've met a lot of these people. Even in my classes now, it's crazy the amount of people that I'm in these classes with that can barely even read, okay? I don't know. I don't have anything else on this. We've been going for almost 2 hours.
Just under 2 hours for now.
I don't know how many people are going to listen to this, but I hope the people that do listen to this, they got something from this, because we really went in depth on our ideas on these things. And, we are very radically different than the mainstream conservatives or libertarians or Republicans, college Republicans our age, but it's because we looked into this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I don't have anything else to say. Do you have, Bobby?
I don't.
Okay, so with that said, we're going to close out the show. Still going to have the Sunday show. We're not going to have a guest on this Sunday. I thought we were. But
the week after, we're looking to have a guest, though. We have someone who wants to do it. So.
Yeah, and we're looking to have a lot of guests, actually, potentially in the future. And also some pretty big interviews potentially coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. But with that said, thank you for listening to another episode of Trump Republic Radio, and have a good one.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.